Aperture.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Varun Nayar, and I'm the assistant editor of Aperture magazine and also of the book we'll be talking about tonight, which is Kimowan Metchewais' A Kind of Prayer. For those of you who might not be familiar with Aperture, we're a nonprofit that was founded in 1952 by a group of artists, writers, and curators as a common ground for photography. Aperture today is a multi-platform publisher that unites the photography community in print, in person, and online. With this program, we're pleased to honor the late Cree artist Kimowan and take some time to discuss his singular body of work. This season, Aperture has published A Kind of Prayer, the first ever survey dedicated to Kimowan and his expansive body of photographic and mixed media work. Kimowan was a multidisciplinary artist who began his career working as an illustrator and editor at the native newspaper Windspeaker in Alberta. After his untimely death at the age of 47 in 2011, Kimowan left behind a wholly original body of photographic and mixed media work. At the center of his practice is an extensive Polaroid archive, which addresses a range of themes, including from the artist's body, performative self-portraiture, language, landscapes, and everyday subjects, themes that have served as a source material for other media, such as painting and collage. Kimowan was a contemporary artist of stunning originality, and until now, his work has been woefully understudied and underexposed. A Kind of Prayer is a comprehensive overview that showcases this essential artist's vision. I'd like to take a moment to thank the editor of this book, Michael Famaghetti, as well as the contributors, Christopher Green, Emily Mozami, and Jeff Whetstone, for their work in making this monograph possible. Tonight's discussion on Kimowan's life and work is presented by three impressive scholars, writers, and artists. First, Rebecca Trautmann is an assistant curator of contemporary art at the National Museum of the American Indian and project curator of the National Native American Veterans Memorial. She has curated the exhibitions Vantage Point, the Contemporary Native Art Collection, Making Marks, Prints from the Crow's Shadow Press, and is co-curator of Stretching the Canvas, 8 Decades of Native Painting. Christopher Green is a writer and art historian based in New York, whose research and writing focuses on modern and contemporary Indigenous art. His criticism, essays, and reviews have appeared in Aperture, Art in America, Frieze, and the Brooklyn Rail, among other publications. He currently serves as visiting assistant professor of art history at Swarthmore College. Wendy is an Upsaloka artist based in Portland. Her work has been launched. Wendy Red Star is an Upsaloka artist based in Portland. Her work has been included in numerous solo and group exhibitions and is featured in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Brooklyn Museum, St. Louis Art Museum, and the IAIA Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. She also guest edited Aperture magazine's fall 2020 issue titled Native America and published her first major comprehensive monograph, Delegation, with Aperture in 2022. Aperture's programs are made possible by generous donations from our board of trustees, our members and other individuals, and in part by the New York State Legislature. In addition, Aperture would like to offer gratitude and respect to the Lenape peoples, past, present, and future. We, as an organization, acknowledge that Aperture is located on the island known as Manhattan in Lenape homeland. We will be answering audience questions towards the end of the program, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat throughout the event and conversation, and we'll get to them at the very end. Thank you, everyone, and I'll now pass things on over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Varun. Thank you to Aperture for organizing this panel and for publishing such a beautiful, thoughtfully designed and authored book to bring Kimowan Metchewais' work before a wider audience. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight with Wendy and Christopher to talk about Kimowan's work and about the book, A Kind of Prayer. Thank you and welcome to everyone, joining us this evening. I'd like to begin too by gratefully acknowledging the Indigenous peoples from whose ancestral homelands we all gather this evening, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes in these places today. Recognizing, though, that such an acknowledgement alone is not enough, and that as the National Museum of the American Indians vision statement guides the museum, we should work together toward equity and justice for Indigenous peoples. I'm Rebecca Trautmann, and as Varun noted, I'm an assistant curator of contemporary art at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, where much of Kimowan's work and his archive now reside. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So before his untimely passing in 2011, Kimowan made known to then NMAI curator Kathleen Ash Milby, who's now at the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, his wish to bequeath to the museum his work and his extensive personal archive. Following his passing, Kathleen worked with archivist Michael Pond, Kimowan's then fiancée Angie Thiessen, his brother Luther McLean, and his close friends Lena Wilder and Jeff Whetstone to review and organize the work for transfer to the museum. I'd like to acknowledge all of their work and their care and commitment to carrying through Kimowan's wishes, as well as Angie's and Lena's generosity with their knowledge and understanding of Kimowan's work and his intentions for it. I'd also like to acknowledge NMAI's incredible archives, collections, conservation, and registration teams who have cared for, cataloged, and housed the wide range of Kimowan's work and his archive at the museum. Much of his archive has now been digitized and it is accessible online through the Smithsonian's Online Virtual Archive, or SOVA, and I believe that we'll share a link to that in the chat. And images of his artwork in the collection are accessible through the museum's website as well. And finally, I'd also like to thank archivist Emily Moazami, who's worked closely with Kimowan's archive and contributed a moving essay on its significance to the book. I first became aware of Kimowan as an artist when we overlapped as graduate students at the University of New Mexico in the late 1990s. I was working on my MA in Native American art history while he was working on his MFA. I'm sorry to say that we didn't really get to know one another, but over the years, I was aware of his work from a distance and of the way that he navigated and documented the impact of his illness on his life and his work. I've come to know Kimowan's work more closely through his incredible gift of his artwork and his archive to the museum. The collection includes 160 artworks, including mixed media paintings, photographs, and wall-sized collages that he called paper walls and that folded compactly for transport, as well as archival materials, including sketchbooks and journals, hard drives, and boxes of the Polaroid photographs, nearly 1,000, that were integral to his practice. Many of his Polaroids and other works from the collection are reproduced in the Aperture book, A Kind of Prayer. At the NMAI, the collection can be cared for, published, and exhibited, and made available to researchers both in person and from a distance. And I think this brings us now to Wendy and Christopher, who both encountered Kimowan's work, though not for the first time, I don't think, during research fellowships at the museum. I believe Wendy was there in 2019 and Chris in 2018 to 2019. So Wendy, why don't we start with you? You wrote in a recent New York Times essay about seeing yourself in the work of an artist that you never met. Could you talk a little about how you came to know Kimowan's work and why you felt such a connection with it?
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here. I've not had the pleasure to personally meet Kimowan, but he's been a huge inspiration for me as an artist. And I would say sort of my first memory of seeing Kimowan's work was a few years after grad school. And I was working as an adjunct professor at Portland State University and teaching a class on contemporary Native art. And so I was looking and researching contemporary Native artists for students to interview, and started, looking at different artists, Larry McNeil being one of them, reaching out to these artists and becoming friends with some of these artists. And through social media, following Larry McNeil, he wrote this beautiful post about Kimowan. And I thought, wow, this is such a really nice post about this person. They sound really interesting. And obviously somebody that Larry really respected. So as social media does, I clicked on the link to go to Kimowan's Facebook page. And then from there, just started kind of looking at everything and was really drawn to sort of these folders of images that would be cataloged in various ways. I think I mentioned in the New York Times article about a folder of Native people in glasses or goggles. And a lot of the Native people, a lot of the photos in there were actually Crow. So I think even my great-great-grandfather was in one of them. So I thought it was pretty funny. So that was kind of my first introduction.
Sorry, finding the unmute button there. And Chris, would you talk a little bit about how you first became aware of Kimowan's work? So you wrote an essay in the Native America special issue of Aperture that Wendy edited on Kimowan's work, and then you expanded that essay for the book. And I'm actually going to advance the slide to the to let us look at the image of the cover of the book. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about how you came to know Kimowan's work?
Of course, and let me reiterate my thanks and gratitude for being invited to be part of this conversation. I'm currently speaking from Lenapehoking in present-day New Jersey, and I really need to extend gratitude as well to Wendy for having the concept and editing that fantastic issue of Aperture focused on Native American photographers and artists, because I had, like you said, Rebecca, encountered Kimowan's work while a research fellow at the Smithsonian, and not in any depth, but really just seeing it hanging on some of the racks in the NMAI's storage in Maryland, and seeing references to it in some of the archival documents and boxes in the archives in the Vine Deloria reading room, and had never gone into any depth until I received the invitation from Wendy and Michael Hamagetti to contribute an essay on Kimowan's work. And it was at that moment that, as an art historian, I realized how little and really how virtually no critical art historical writing had been done on his practice, on his life, on his career, and realized what importance it was to create and craft some kind of tribute, to put into writing some small slice of the depth and the beauty of his life and his practice that illustrated it. And so I'm really thankful to Wendy for having had the vision to identify Kimowan as one of the artists to focus on, because I feel like it was a gift to be able to have the space to dive into his work and do justice in print for the first time. And I'm so grateful that we now have this publication and a new number of different contributors to be able to see the different elements and see the breadth of his oeuvre in full, in a way that has rarely been accessible. But I'll note that today the NMAI has done a fantastic job of digitizing, and I drew so heavily on the digitized archives and works that are available through the Smithsonian's archive for my own research and essay. And it was just in leafing through those digital repositories and doing some of that deep research, not just onto Kimowan's Facebook page, but also into the Wayback Machine, into archives of his blogs, of his writings, that I could see how so much of his own life, his personality, his words were in this interstitial space between this very temporary, fragmentary, internet-based digital presence and the equally ephemeral, equally fragile photographic material he left at the NMAI, and how he was really an artist who, when he passed away, was making such a strong move into the digital as a field of research and as a field of being, that we could see how much he had left to give and how much he had left to work. And I hope that even in the kind of book that we have together, some of that essence of the flipping, of the moving between images, of the kinds of online Facebook photo albums that Wendy referenced, is there in his Polaroids, in his archival practice, because he was such an intermedial artist and was very much, as he wrote in some of his posts, a child of the digital age, of the internet age, and saw it as an indigenous space. This book, in many ways, is a way that we can bring together some of those digital spaces of the archive, of the Facebook and online record, and his photographic practice in a way to really feel and really bring a tactile sense to.
Thank you. Yeah, and Kimowan wrote a little bit too about about the internet really being kind of an ideal Indigenous space, a way for connecting and for communicating and connecting through images and words. Yeah, I'm going to say, before we go too much further into discussion, I'm just going to say a little bit more about Kimowan to introduce anyone who's not familiar with him and his work, and then I'd like to kind of get deep into our discussion. So Kimowan Metchewais, who formerly used the name McLean as well, was born in Oxbow, Saskatchewan in 1963. He was he was Cree and a member of the Cold Lake First Nations. I'm also going to scroll through a few images as I'm talking, starting with some of his Polaroids. So he lived much of his early life on the reserve and in nearby Edmonton. He worked for a number of years, as Varun mentioned, at an Indigenous newspaper called Windspeaker, doing political cartoons, graphics, and later editing. He earned a BFA from the University of Alberta in 1996 and an MFA from the University of New Mexico in 1999. He'd chosen UNM for the strength of its photography and Native American art history programs. Following a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, he taught studio art at UNC, ultimately as an associate professor. Metchewais didn't consider himself a photographer or a painter, but rather a sculptor who worked in 2 dimensions. In his photo-based works, he layered photographs, drawings, text, and other materials, often folding, taping, and rephotographing the works, and then printing them, as you can see in this work here, which is a self-portrait from about 2006. He lived with a rare brain tumor for years, which really impacted his life and his work. He passed away in 2011 at the age of 47, leaving behind a really extensive and highly original body of work, which is now coming to greater recognition, including through the efforts of Aperture and of people like Wendy and Christopher and others. A couple more of his Polaroids. And this photograph shows the way that the Polaroids were stored when they came to the museum. He had made these handmade, custom-made boxes that they fit just perfectly in. He had them organized by subject and then arranged alphabetically. There were about 1,000 of these Polaroids, and they were used as references for his work, also sometimes incorporated directly into the work, sometimes cut apart and taped back together, sometimes used in photo transfers. So just really a highly original and personal way of working. So I thought maybe we could start by talking a little bit about ways that Kimowan explored and expressed and addressed identity in his work, including through his self-portraits, his kind of performative self-portraiture, including photos where he addressed, for example, here, the significance of long hair in many Native cultures, connections with Indianness, ideas of Indianness, or with power, with tradition, also addressing his illness. So yeah, would either of you like to jump in?
Well, I'll say that one of the incredible things that Kimowan left us was a new vocabulary for trends and advancements in Indigenous photography. And some of his sketchbooks, his notebooks, contain this wealth of new ways of thinking through what it was to be a photographer and what it was to make images as a Native American photographer. And he had a term that is repeated throughout a number of essays that came from his notes, which was the idea of the post-Curtis portrait. And so many of these self-portraits, I feel, are ways in which he's exploring the very precarious tension that exists for so many Indigenous photographers, which is how to deal with the baggage of the ethnographic gaze and how to at once be able to represent and depict oneself and one's community in ways that can go beyond some of the legacies of the likes of Edward Curtis and the stereotypes that remain in the American popular imagination. And his term of a post-Curtis portrait, I believe, is his way of trying to reach towards and move towards that. And these photographs, which are both constantly humorous, that are so engaging and direct, and which in their materiality cut up and rearrange so as to question the solidity of the body or the subject that he's creating using hair extensions, using costumes. He's at once constantly poking fun at and also recreating what it is to be a self-portrait and a portrait of an Indigenous body at the same time. And Wendy, I know in your own work, you are constantly working in a similar place of portraiture, of costuming, of the play between artifice and reality. And I feel like you and Kimowan were on very similar pages in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at these images, I just feel like how fearless Kimowan is about interacting with a photo, and that it's not precious and that you can cut it, you can tape it. And those things I really like, and I really relate to that because my background, both in my BFA and MFA, is in sculpture. And I'm very lucky and grateful that the photo community has embraced me. It's been wonderful, but I've always sort of hesitated when people call me a photographer. And I think that was the case with Kimowan too. So I really relate to, for instance, I made a piece in grad school called The Four Seasons where I was in it and built dioramas and then photographed it. But in order for me to incorporate photography, I had to feel like I was making something 3D. So making a diorama, being in it. And I see that in Kimowan's work by turning these photographic images into 3D objects that you can like manipulate and stitch back together. And I just think that's so powerful and humanizing in an interesting way as well.
Yeah, and you definitely see here, and we'll see in some of the other works that we look at as we go along, some of these really large wall works that again are, images cut apart, taped back together. Sometimes you're seeing photographs of tape, sometimes it's the actual tape. Sometimes he would fold works up and carry them around in his pocket for weeks so that the creases would really get worked into the paper. And it's actually kind of fascinating just seeing the way that these works are now stored at the museum, that they have custom-made boxes to protect them as they're kind of, refolded and layered into the cases. He talked about wanting, about seeing kind of a connection in the way that these works are folded to parfleshes, and to portability, to being, having a history as a nomadic people. And yeah, so I think it's really fascinating. I love also seeing, I'll go to the next slide, seeing the sense of humor in many of these performative self-portraiture works, which I think also really connects closely to your work, Wendy.
Yeah, and I think, the fact that you bring up parfleche, and I'm currently very obsessed with parfleche and making over 200 paintings, and I've got one right behind me as well. So there's just so many things when looking into Kimowan's work that I feel that we have very similar interests, from also ledger drawings and sort of depicting himself in those as well. And then of course, humor. And I just have to say, I think I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think it's true. Native people really have good senses of humor. And that's definitely one way that I connect with other Native peoples, especially Plains people. We like to joke with each other quite a bit. So that's something that I can see and relate to as well.
And this performative portraiture also kind of you see in works of family and community members too. This is called The Photographer from 2000. This is Striped Man, and this is his brother Luther McLean from 1998. This is another just incredibly beautiful, one of his last works done from about 2010, titled Rain Cloud Over the Head Mask Collection. It's a photo collage with acrylic paint and ink on canvas. And this work, I believe, is included in the Native American Translation exhibition organized by Aperture and curated by Wendy that's traveling right now. Wendy, do you want to say anything about why you decided to include this work in the exhibition?
I guess first I want to talk a little bit about doing the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. And I actually split my time between 2018 and 2019. I was supposed to do the whole thing in 2018, but there was a government shutdown. So I had to reschedule. So I'm surprised I didn't see Christopher there. But yeah, it was towards the end of my residency where I was focused towards the end at looking at images and photographs. And Emily took me to one room where I could like sit down and look through some different binders. And then that's when I saw the catalog boxes of Kimowan's, and I was just like thrilled. I didn't know that his work was there. So that's the first time I learned that. And I was just so delighted to actually get a chance to go through all of those Polaroids. And then Emily was like, oh yeah, there's also sketchbooks. And I was like, oh, I wish I would have known this sooner. Because I think it was literally maybe my last day. So that really stuck with me. And then when I was invited to edit the issue with Aperture Native America, Kimowan was actually the first artist. It's like, oh, if I get this chance, I really want to include Kimowan and have an opportunity to interact with his work and learn more about the work. And through that, now we have a traveling exhibition that is currently in Milwaukee. Yeah, it sort of rotated between Polaroid images, the hand images, and this work, which I just think is profoundly stunning. And going through the book too, there are so many works that I had not seen. So that was really cool to see more of his work as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and as we get a little bit later, I wanted to talk some more about the book, show some images of the book. It's just really beautifully designed, and we can talk about the essays in the book too. I do want to note that the Aperture exhibition, Native American Translation, is, as you said, now in Milwaukee, and will then be traveling to Tampa and to Austin.
I just want to say that that's been such a great experience. There are some very amazing artists in that, but it's also just really lovely to know, like Rebecca Belmore just did a talk in Milwaukee, and several other artists have done talks at different institutions. So I'm just thrilled to see this work travel and people get to engage with it, and the artists get to have opportunities besides being in the magazine itself.
And it's wonderful that it's traveling so widely too. I had a chance to see it when it was at Haverford College outside of Philadelphia last year, and it was really a beautiful show. So yeah, people should have a lot of chances to see it, hopefully, or a lot of people in different places should have a chance to see it. So, so this is another mixed media work. This is called Sandias from 1988. It's photo collage, ink, acrylic paint, crayon, plastic embossing labels, adhesive tape, and ledger paper on canvas. And you see again here, well, first, the mountains in the background are the Sandia Mountains in New Mexico. So this was done while Kimowan was at UNM working on his MFA. But you see again references to parfleche painted designs, these abstract, geometric, colorful designs, as well as to ledger drawings, which were made by many Native men who were held in captivity at places like Fort Marion, Florida in the late 19th century. So I don't know if either of you want to say anything about this work before we move on.
I think that Kimowan was such an artist, and he was so fluent, not just in the various media that he employed, but he was so fluent in many languages of modernism and many languages, especially of Indigenous art, both from his own Cree and Plains heritage, but also very savvy about some of the trends that he saw emerging as a younger artist in the Native art world more broadly. And I see a lot of his early work playing with this language of collage and assemblage as he's looking towards the art of mentors like Joanne Cardinal Schubert or Jane Ash Poitras or George Longfish, and working with some of the images and the legacies of the contemporary Native art movement from the 1980s, and then moving through it and moving past it. And it's so appropriate that Wendy mentioned being a sculptor or a photographer turned sculptor or vice versa, because Jeff Whetstone's essay in the publication recounts a really beautiful interaction, which Kimowan also mentions that he started off as a painter and is not a photographer, but considers himself to be a sculptor of paper. And the ways in which works like this see that kind of intermedial nature, how the parfleche is at once a kind of neo-concrete sculpture as well as a painting, something that unfolds, is manipulated into different flattened planes, how ledger drawings moved across different supports from hide to paper to canvas, and how photographs and collages all being engaged in a very postmodernist way. He was really just working through so many diverse art histories and combining them and meeting them in such a rich and deep way that it speaks to the depth of his training and his practice and his real depth of language with these multiple modernities, not just any singular one.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I just want to kind of echo your appreciation for Jeff Whetstone's essay. It's such a lovely personal essay about how he and Kimowan first met, how they knew each other as they were both teaching together. I love the conversation too that you referenced about, I think Jeff asked him to teach a photography class and he said, but I'm not a photographer, I'm a sculptor. Jeff said, but you said you were a painter last time. And he said, oh, actually I'm a sculptor, but I'm working in 2 dimensions. And yeah, it's really a wonderful essay. I loved hearing about the work that he did, Funeral for a Wasp, right, at the old tobacco factory. So I'm going to move ahead to, this is a piece called Without Ground, which is closely connected to an installation that you wrote about, Chris, that Kimowan did for the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania. So Kimowan did deal in his work with the issue of colonial memory. He talked about North America as being a crime scene for Indigenous people. And Wendy, you echo this in your New York Times essay. So Chris, I know you wrote quite a bit about the installation linked to this work. Do you want to say a little bit about it?
Yeah, and it was a really meditative investigation, in Kimowan's words, an investigation of a crime scene, that crime being colonial theft, being dispossession, being genocide. And the installation consisted of photo transfers, much like we're seeing here, on the walls of a particular ramp space at the ICA Philadelphia. And the photo transfers were of Kimowan himself, and in a kind of searching pose, his body repeated as he looked through this empty ground, this empty white ground of the museum wall. And one of the most recurring and I think touching metaphors that Kimowan uses for both this kind of crime, its impacts on the body, and his own practice is this idea that the legacy of colonial crimes is etched into his bones. And he wrote about this installation as etching these images into the bones of the building. And to combine the idea of photography and the practice of photo transfer with etching and the printmaking process, again, in this kind of intermedial conversation, but one that is intergenerational, that is carved like a tattoo into the body itself, into the bones. There's a really beautiful essay in C Magazine by an author named Lois Taylor Briggs, who discussed this idea of recovery and medicine in the body being intertwined with the idea of recreating the archive. And in this way, Kimowan was both visualizing this idea of being without a ground as the result of the dispossession of colonial history, but also making the institution a kind of site of investigation, also a stand-in for the body as he etched himself onto its bones. And about 10 years later, Dwayne Linklater had an incredible intervention in the gallery where he tried to uncover the traces of these photo transfers by scraping away the wall. And it became another kind of crime scene, another kind of archaeological dig for the site of that investigation, of that installation of Kimowan's presence just a few years after his untimely passing. And in that way, Dwayne Linklater also used the digging process to metaphorically relate the art, the careers, the poetry of Indigenous artists to what has happened to this landscape. So we have this conversation over the years between the artists that also takes place in the bones of the institution, just as it does in the bones of the artist and in the medium itself. It's an incredible piece to think through, and virtuosic in his use of photo transfer techniques and media, which he explored in his MFA, and I think speaks to also the incredible legacy of the UNM photo program and the art program there, which was what attracted him to New Mexico, because he learned such technical expertise. I know that his close friends, Larry McNeil, Will Wilson, Rosalie Favell, they were there as studio mates, likewise working with such fantastic techniques and such a beautiful handle on photography as a medium that it almost becomes absurd to hear him say he's a sculptor or painter instead when he demonstrates his ability with photography as a medium like this. We understand how it enters into something so much more than photography through those techniques, through that ability.
I think this piece is so phenomenal. It's not in the book, right? I don't think it's in the book. I was like looking through.
You know, and this piece actually may not be in the book. I added this one to the slideshow, and this one may not be in the book. I believe there is an image from the actual installation, though.
Yes. And I just want to say Dwayne Linklater does a really good job when he has exhibitions at different institutions to ask what's the history of showing Native people within those institutions. And so I think this piece where he tried to, peel back the layers to find Kimowan's work was just so powerful. But it really speaks to Dwayne and his advocacy for Native artists to show in contemporary institutions.
Yeah, I have to agree. This particular piece, which I think is a study for the installation or a work that's derivative of it, but in a way that's different from the installation that was at the ICA in Philadelphia, the kind of ghostly after image here of the bodies to the side, which look almost like a cyanotype or a kind of after image or ghost print from the process. They add this depth of character and presence that the solidity of Without Ground gets at with the way he, in that original installation, would fade some of the bodies as if using atmospheric perspective to extend them in space. But here it becomes almost more like a crime scene. They become much more ghostly, much more spectral. And the paper here, which of course on the screen, it's impossible to tell what here is folded, what is taped, what is rephotographed or not, is just so textural. It feels almost like this has been pulled up from a basement or some kind of other crime scene that investigators are just discovering as an integral piece of evidence. And the texture of it, the color of it, brings to mind some of the techniques that Kimowan would use by dipping his papers in different waters, in tobacco leaf soaked waters, in different materialities to evoke more than just image in these kinds of works, to evoke really their matter, their stuff, which makes this piece all the more physically and tactilely interesting.
Thank you. Yes, I'm realizing that it's already getting a little bit late. The hour has been flying. I want to just quickly show a couple of images, but I want to be sure that we have plenty of time to talk about the Cold Lake series. I just wanted to mention that another issue connected to colonial memory that Kimowan addressed in his work was tobacco. His 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of North Carolina was to address the origin of tobacco. And so he was looking at tobacco both as a sacred plant, a sacred substance, for a sacred practice for many Indigenous people, but also the way that it was commercialized at his own smoking addiction. So he created this figure, the Marlboro Indian, or a man called Lucky, and these are both part of the works on the origin of tobacco. And if either of you wanted to say anything about these works, please go ahead, or else we can move ahead to the Cold Lake series. Okay. So I wanted to be sure that we had time to talk about the Cold Lake series, which is just an incredible body of work. Some have kind of called it his magnum opus, or, the work that just really addresses his community at Cold Lake. So he took a large series of photographs from 2004 to 2006 of people at Cold Lake in the community, many times of people, including young people, wading in the lake, and really explores this close connection, relationship of his community to this place, to Cold Lake. He portrayed community members in a very straightforward way. I'm going to skip ahead, but I'll come back to both of these images. So he portrayed young people, especially in the lake, just, wading in the water. And there's kind of almost a mythical quality, kind of an origin story quality to these works. So I will open it up to either of you, and I can go to any of the images that you want to talk about, either this, I guess I'll say one more thing, which is just that in Kimowan's essay in the book, he talks about this idea of live relics in his work, and particularly in this work. He goes in depth into this piece, talking about kind of hidden meanings, hidden memory that's embedded in the work. So this piece, it appears to have 6 figures. It's actually just 2 figures, but this is a composite of 5 different photographs that were taken by Kimowan's mother from the shore of Kimowan and his cousin. As they were both fishing, his cousin's fishing line became entangled in his hair, I believe, and so they kind of walked together so that Kimowan could help him untangle it. But there's just a really beautiful quote by Kimowan about the piece. He says, "My mother took the photographs as she stood on the shore of this lake. My mother, Conrad, the lake, and I are bound together in this image. The image affirms familial ties. It is a record of family love. The lake and the sky are included as part of the family. They are all my relations." This piece was also, as he often did with his work, soaked it in water that had been stained with tobacco, and talked about that as kind of a baptism for the work. Again, he was talking about this idea of post-Curtis photographs of contemporary Indians.
And I should say that the title of the publication, A Kind of Prayer, comes from Kimowan's essay discussing this work. And he is discussing tobacco as, or the paper being baptized in this rust and tobacco colored water, and how tobacco is a kind of handshake, a promise, an agreement, a relationship. And then he says Cold Lake is a kind of prayer. And I get the sense that in the text, the words Cold Lake are italicized, suggesting the title of the work itself is a kind of prayer. But in that, I also take that the Cold Lake as a site, as a place, as a landscape, as a community, as the First Nation, that Cold Lake in all of those meanings is a kind of prayer for Kimowan. and that this image, this work bundles those things and layers them in both the photographic process as it unfolds over time in its printing process, in its materiality as it takes on the spiritual material connotations of tobacco, and in terms of the history and the personal relations that Rebecca, you outlined there. That all of these things together are a kind of prayer, and that idea of prayer, of immersion, of baptism in the waters of the photographic emulsion, in the waters of the lake, are what makes Kimowan's portraiture, his photography, so deeply at once personal, but such a poetic meditation on particularly Indigenous relations to place and community, so layered and tied up in all of these meanings and relations all at once. I think you use the word magnum opus so appropriately, because this series and these works in particular bring so many of his concerns together into a single work or series of works, that it's hard to not be lost in these works, which themselves were at times wall-sized.
I wanted to speak to the live relic in that essay as well. And it just makes me think of, like, when I do work about my community, and with the understanding that my community knows exactly what my elk tooth dress is, or where this certain landscape I took a photo is. And I really appreciated how Kimowan talked about sort of straddling two places, being able to have perspective from the outside, but also have the knowledge from the inside, from the interior. And that really speaks to me because I'm in Portland, Oregon, and actually I left the Crow Reservation at 18. But I think having that distance and then traveling back home, I start to see these things that maybe as a kid, I just sort of took for granted, but now having the perspective, I realize how important they are, and how important they are to the community and to our history.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm going to go through a couple more of the photos from the Cold Lake series. And let's see. Here we are. So this is just an incredibly beautiful photo too. It's titled Cold Lake Venus from 2005. And there's another really nice quote from Kimowan about this work. He said, "Look at us emerge. We are beautiful, standing in a magical place, just back from the Walmart." And, again, tying the kind of mythical, kind of almost like a creation story, but to the very contemporary, pushing back against the positioning of Indigenous people as being in a forgotten past rather than being in the present, being contemporary people. And then this piece, I think, is also really beautiful, closely related to the other larger works from this series too, but with a group of children waiting, a group of young people waiting in the lake. And I want to show just a few images of the book itself too, because it's so beautifully designed. And then we'll take time for a couple of questions from the audience. And I'll mention again the essays in the book as I'm showing these slides. So there's an artist statement by Kimowan. There's the essay that we have been discussing about live relics in his work. Christopher's really, really thoughtful and insightful essay expanded from the Native America issue of Aperture, and an essay by NMAI's archivist Emily Mozami talking about the significance of Kimowan's archive being at NMAI and the importance of bringing Indigenous voices into the archive. So there is a question in the Q&A asking, was the work of Romare Bearden influential in Kimowan's development? And I have to say that I don't know that. Have either of you come across any references to Romare Bearden in Kimowan's work?
I haven't come across any references to Romare Bearden specifically, but I will say that Kimowan's notes, his teaching, his education are so deep in the canon of modern contemporary art and 20th century art in particular that I can't imagine he was not familiar with Romare Bearden, because he was familiar with many of the other great names that would have come through not just survey classes, but his own deep study of various, especially photographic processes and ways that artists have used collage and assemblage and mixed media work in the 20th century. So while it wasn't necessarily, I think, an explicit reference, I think he was very much familiar with those names, those kinds of artists, and certainly would have looked, I think, very closely at ways other artists would have been playing with these mashups of imagery and photographs and collaged approaches to the body, like Romare Bearden would have showed him.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see, we have a couple of other questions. Why do you think he was specifically drawn to Polaroids? Do either of you want to respond to that? And I can say a little bit that I think you know, he talked about kind of the silkiness of a newly printed photograph. He talked about the tactility of photographs and photographs as objects, and I think you know, Polaroids are very a very tactile object. They were also something he could work with kind of instantaneously. He sometimes, as he was creating works that involved kind of staging a scene, he could take one photograph after another and kind of there's a photograph showing where he's lying at the base of a staircase and then has a whole row of Polaroids lined up, and so you can see that he's been kind of looking at the Polaroid, repositioning, taking another Polaroid. So there's a very kind of iterative process, I guess.
Yeah, they were also not just image in his oeuvre, but they were also physical material. They're also the stuff of making for him. Mm-hmm. And they were also a personal archive that he created, that he built up over the course of his life and his career. And we're talking about thousands of images that are in the NMAI collection now, which recur throughout his oeuvre, that he retakes, that he rearranges, that became a kind of personal counter archive. And I think that it became a way that he could, against the structures of a colonial archive, against the ways in which image banks become reconstituted sites of particular power systems, I believe he was creating his own archive in order to escape and be free of those restrictions, and be free of those lines of power that so often structure not just the representation of Native peoples, but also the telling of their culture for them by others. I think this was his way of creating a contemporary archive and presence through his own choices of images that could serve both as source, but also as new expression.
Mm-hmm. And Wendy, it reminds me a bit of your installation with the where you drew on the, you know, both historical and family photos, but the photo, the installation based on the Crow Fair parade and the images of people over time, just a very personal use of images.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I'm drawn to is the writing that he leaves us to think about or find clues within. So that's something that I think is really interesting. Plus incorporating his indigenous language as well.
Thank you. Yes. So I think that's unfortunately going to have to be our last question, because we just have sped through the hour so quickly. So I've stopped sharing my screen now. And
hi, everyone. So I wanted to just say Thank you so much for that engaging and enlightening conversation. To quickly introduce myself, I'm the Education and Public Programs Coordinator here at Aperture, and I had the pleasure of organizing this panel and bringing all of you here tonight. I wanted to take a moment to personally thank our panelists, Rebecca, Christopher, and Wendy, for bringing such an insight on the work and legacy of Kimowan. We are so grateful for the perspectives that you were able to bring to the conversation. For attendees, we are extending an exclusive discount to buy your own copy of A Kind of Prayer at aperture.org. You can find that information in the chat. And we hope that this discussion inspired you to explore the work further of Kimowan and also join our growing Aperture community through future programming. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Again, thank you so much to all of these panelists. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And my thanks too to Christopher and Wendy. It's been such a pleasure talking with both of you.
And I just want to say thank you to his family and his friends as well.
Yeah, I know a number in the chat. I saw Luther in the participant list. I know Lena Wilder is in the chat, as well as Ann Humphreys, a number of close loved ones and family and friends. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.